The courtroom was grand, with towering walls of shimmering crystal and seats filled with the elite of the alien society, known as the Valkyrie. Among them sat leaders, military commanders, and noble families, all watching intently as the young alien girl, Rela, stood defiantly before the high tribunal. She was no ordinary citizen. Rela came from one of the most powerful families in the Valkyrie Empire, her lineage steeped in wealth and prestige. But today, none of that mattered. Today, she was a criminal in their eyes. Her crime was one of rebellion. For years, Rela had challenged the strict, authoritarian rules of her society. She had questioned the subjugation of weaker species, including humans, and had openly criticized the way her people exerted control through fear. Her defiance had escalated into an open act of insurrection when she had sabotaged a military operation, freeing human prisoners that were intended for labor camps. This was the last straw for the Valkyrie leadership. They could no longer ignore her actions or her growing influence among the younger, more progressive citizens. Rela had expected execution, or at least life imprisonment. Instead, the tribunal, led by her own family members, sought a punishment far more humiliating, one designed to strip her of her dignity, her status, and her pride. The sentence was announced in cold, calculated tones. Rela would be given as a slave to a human, a symbolic act meant to display the superiority of the Valkyrie people over the very species she had fought to protect. The crowd murmured in shock. Giving one of their own, especially from such a powerful family, to a human, one of the lowest in the Valkyrie hierarchy, was an unthinkable punishment. Rela's eyes blazed with anger, but she held her head high, refusing to let them see her break. This was meant to humiliate her, to reduce her to nothing, to make her a living example of what happened to those who dared to defy the Empire. The tribunal had already selected a human. He was a soldier, a man from a distant colony who had fought in the wars between their species. His name was not even mentioned, as if to emphasize his insignificance. For Rela, it wasn't about the human himself. It was about the message this punishment sent. They wanted her to submit, to be crushed under the weight of their authority, to prove once and for all that no one, not even someone of her standing, could escape the might of the Valkyrie Empire. The day they brought Rela to him, Jonas could hardly believe the absurdity of the situation. A Valkyrie official, dressed in ornate robes and flanked by guards, presented the alien girl to him as though she were some kind of prize. The official spoke with cold detachment, explaining the terms of her punishment, that she was now his property, his slave. He was expected to keep her in servitude, a punishment for her rebellion, and a twisted symbol of the Valkyrie Empire's dominance over humanity. Jonas, a former soldier who had seen the horrors of the war between their species, felt a wave of disgust rise in his throat. Slavery was abhorrent to him, a relic of barbarism that his people had long since rejected. The idea of owning another being, alien or not, was unthinkable. Yet here they were, standing in the middle of his outpost on the edge of a barren planet, with this young woman being handed over to him like a piece of property. He stared at the official, his face hardening as the implications of what was being asked of him sank in. Rela, her hands bound and her chin held high in defiance, refused to meet his eyes, though Jonas could see the flicker of resentment and frustration in her rigid posture. He could only imagine what it must feel like for her, once a figure of high standing, now reduced to this humiliating position, all for daring to defy her rulers. Without saying a word, Jonas stepped forward and took the knife from his belt. The guard stiffened, but he made no aggressive move. Instead, he knelt down and calmly sliced through the ropes binding Rela's wrists. She looked at him then, her eyes narrowing in suspicion, clearly expecting some cruel trick. But Jonas merely stood, turned to the Valkyrie official, and spoke in a voice that carried quiet authority. "I don't keep slaves," Jonas said flatly, his voice heavy with contempt. "You can take your laws and your punishments back to your empire. I won't play along with your twisted sense of justice." The official, taken aback by the human's refusal, stammered something about duty, about the consequences of rejecting such a mandate. But Jonas cut him off. He knew full well the potential risks involved in defying the Valkyrie order, but that didn't matter. He wasn't going to be part of this perverse display of control. Jonas turned to Rela, her confusion evident, and said simply, "You're free. I don't care what they told you." The first few days after Jonas freed Rela were filled with an unspoken tension that weighed heavily in the air. She didn't trust him, and why should she? To her, humans were unpredictable, their motives often cloaked in kindness that could easily turn to betrayal. Rela had been raised to believe that humans were a lesser species, subjugated by the Varkari for their own good, and yet here she was indebted to one of them, a position that rankled her pride and defied everything she had been taught. Rela stayed in the quarters Jonas had offered her, but her every movement was guarded, her every word laced with a defiant edge. She kept her distance, her gaze cold and calculating whenever Jonas tried to speak with her. She was still a prisoner in her own mind, trapped not by chains, but by the deeply ingrained mistrust she felt toward her supposed liberator. She tested him at every turn, looking for cracks in his facade, expecting at any moment for his true nature to reveal itself. Jonas, for his part, gave her space, understanding that she needed time to adjust. But he could sense the undercurrent of hostility simmering beneath the surface, her defiance manifesting in small acts of rebellion. She ignored his attempts at conversation, refused to follow even the simplest suggestions, and made it clear that she was here on her own terms. Rela's resentment toward him and the situation was palpable, as if she believed he was merely playing a game with her freedom, waiting for the right moment to assert his control. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. After days of silent standoffs and icy glares, Rela confronted Jonas, her voice sharp with accusation. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, standing rigid, her arms crossed as if to shield herself from vulnerability. "Do you think this makes you better than the Varkari? Letting me stay here like I have a choice? Is this your way of proving that humans are different?" Jonas didn't react to her anger, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps frustration, perhaps understanding. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he replied, his voice calm. "You were given to me as a punishment, but I won't play their game. You're free because that's the right thing to do, not because I want anything from you." But Rela wasn't satisfied with his answer. She stepped closer, her gaze challenging. "And what if I don't want your freedom?" she spat, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What if I don't believe you?" Jonas met her stare, unflinching, his expression unreadable. He could see the wall she had built around herself, the defenses she had erected to protect against whatever cruelty she expected from him. But instead of pushing back, he simply said, "That's your choice. You don't have to trust me, but I won't force you to do anything." As the days turned into weeks, the sharp edges of their relationship began to soften, though neither would openly admit it. Rela, still guarded and wary, gradually found herself observing Jonas in a different light. He wasn't the oppressive figure she had anticipated, nor did he hold the self-righteousness she had accused him of. Instead, he was quiet, consistent, and surprisingly thoughtful in his actions. He never forced her into conversation, but the small gestures, offering her extra supplies without asking, leaving food when he knew she hadn't eaten, began to chip away at the resentment she clung to. In the beginning, they worked side by side in silence. Rela, with her pride still intact, refused to ask for help, even when tasks became difficult. But Jonas, with a lifetime of soldierly discipline and patience, stepped in without needing to be asked, his actions speaking louder than any words. He repaired damaged equipment around the outpost, always leaving her with space, but also making sure she wasn't struggling unnecessarily. Gradually, the icy tension between them thawed, replaced by an awkward but growing sense of mutual respect. Rela found herself silently watching him, curious about the man who had treated her not as a slave, but as an equal. She saw him repair machines with an ease that belied his rough exterior and discovered a quiet intelligence beneath his stoic demeanor. There were moments, brief but impactful, where Jonas would offer a small piece of advice or a quiet remark that made her reconsider her preconceived notions of humans. One evening, after an exhausting day of repairing a communications array damaged by a storm, Rela sat beside Jonas around a small fire. For the first time since their uneasy partnership began, she spoke without the bitterness that had previously colored their conversations. "You don't talk much about yourself," she said, her voice softer than usual. "What did you do before all this?" Jonas glanced at her, surprised by the shift in her tone, and after a pause, he began to share small pieces of his past. A soldier in a long, brutal war, a man who had seen more destruction than most could imagine. He didn't dwell on the details, but Rela could sense the weight he carried, the burden of loss that perhaps mirrored her own. It was the first moment of real connection between them, a fragile understanding that they were both survivors of their own battles, both navigating the scars of their pasts. As more time passed, the barriers between them continued to erode. They began to talk more openly, and their conversations shifted from practical concerns to deeper, more personal matters. Rela started asking about human culture, about Jonas's world and the people he had left behind, and in turn, she shared fragments of her own life, her family, her rebellion, and the ideals that had led her to defy the Varkari Empire. It wasn't an instant transformation, but slowly, the hostility that had once defined their relationship was replaced by a growing sense of camaraderie. The initial tension had given way to something more complex, a bond forged not just by their shared circumstances, but by a mutual recognition of each other's humanity, or alien nature, as it were, and a respect that neither of them had expected to find. The turning point came unexpectedly, as such moments often do. They had fallen into a routine, working together to maintain the outpost, sharing meals in silence that had slowly become comfortable, and occasionally exchanging stories from their vastly different worlds. But this day was different. A storm, violent and unpredictable, descended on the planet without warning. The winds howled with an intensity that shook the foundation of the outpost, and debris flew like shrapnel through the air. Jonas and Rela scrambled to secure the outpost, racing against the elements to seal off vulnerable areas before the storm could do any permanent damage. They worked in tandem, an unspoken coordination that had developed over time, moving with the kind of fluidity that only came from trust and shared experience. But just as they were finishing, a malfunction in the power grid sent sparks flying. The energy shield that protected the outpost from the worst of the storm flickered, then failed, leaving them exposed to the full force of the deadly winds and flying debris. Rela, who had been closest to the shield generator, was hit first, knocked off her feet by a piece of metal that caught her in the side, sending her crashing to the ground. Jonas reacted without thinking, sprinting toward her as debris rained down around them. He reached her just as a large section of the outpost's outer wall began to give way. Without hesitation, he threw himself over her, shielding her with his body as the wall collapsed. The impact sent them both sprawling, and for a moment everything was chaos. The roar of the storm, the sound of destruction all around them. When the dust settled, Jonas rolled off Rela, coughing and bruised, but more concerned with her condition than his own. She lay still for a moment, stunned and winded, before slowly sitting up, her hand clutching her injured side. Despite the pain etched on her face, she stared at him in disbelief, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You saved me," she managed to say, her voice barely audible over the storm. Jonas, panting and bleeding from a gash on his forehead, simply nodded. "I wasn't going to let you die out here," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. For the first time since they had met, Rela saw something in him that she hadn't noticed before. He wasn't just a human, a former enemy, or the man who had refused to enslave her. He was something more, someone willing to risk his life for hers, not out of obligation or duty, but because he genuinely cared. In that moment, something shifted between them. The walls that Rela had built around herself, the defenses she had kept in place for so long, began to crumble. She realized that Jonas wasn't the enemy she had always believed humans to be. He was just as scarred, just as lost, and just as in need of connection as she was. Jonas helped her to her feet, his arms steadying her as they made their way back to the safety of the outpost's inner chamber. The storm still raged outside, but inside a different kind of storm had passed. The tension that had defined their relationship for so long was gone, replaced by something new, something fragile and uncertain. but undeniably real. After the storm, everything between Jonas and Rela changed. The bond that had started to form was no longer something they could ignore. The near-death experience had stripped away the last remnants of doubt and suspicion, leaving them with a raw and undeniable truth. They were no longer just survivors navigating a hostile world together. They were partners, bound by something deeper than either of them had expected. It wasn't long before Rela and Jonas began to share their lives in a way that felt less like a necessity and more like a choice. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, and with each passing day, the awkwardness and hesitancy between them faded. They no longer walked in silence through the outpost or exchanged only the words needed to get through the day. Instead, they laughed, shared meals, and began to imagine a future beyond their initial alliance for survival. As their relationship deepened, so did the realization that their bond was unlike anything either of them had experienced. For Jonas, Rela was more than just a former enemy or a person he had been thrust into close quarters with. She was intelligent, strong, and fiercely independent, qualities he admired and respected. And for Rela, Jonas had become a symbol of everything she had once dismissed about humanity: compassion, loyalty, and an unwavering sense of justice. Word of their unconventional partnership soon reached the Varkari Empire and the human resistance forces, drawing curiosity and concern. Neither group had ever envisioned such an alliance, much less the idea that a human and a Varkari, two species who had been at odds for so long, could form a bond so close that it would lead to something as profound as marriage. Their decision to marry was not made lightly. Both knew that such a union would carry heavy consequences, not just for themselves, but for their respective peoples. The Varkari Empire viewed interspecies relationships as a betrayal, a dilution of the purity they had long sought to maintain. Similarly, some factions within the human resistance harbored deep mistrust of the Varkari, unable to see past the long years of conflict and oppression. But Jonas and Rela refused to be defined by the old wounds of war. They saw something in each other that transcended the divisions of their pasts, something that defied the rules of both their societies. Together, they decided to marry, not out of defiance, but out of a shared belief that their love could be the bridge between their worlds. The ceremony itself was simple, a quiet affair in the solitude of their outpost, with no grand declarations or lavish rituals. It was a private promise, a vow to stand together against whatever forces would try to tear them apart. For Rela, the marriage represented a full embrace of her new life. She had been given to Jonas as a slave, a punishment for her rebellion against the Varkari. But now, in marrying him, she was making a choice of her own. It was an act of defiance, not just against the Varkari who had sought to punish her, but against the idea that her life, her destiny, could be controlled by anyone but herself. In Jonas, she found not a master but a partner, someone who respected her for who she was, and who had never treated her as anything less than his equal. For Jonas, marrying Rela was more than just an act of love. It was a declaration of acceptance, not only of her, but of the complexities and contradictions that came with their relationship. He knew that their marriage would be viewed with suspicion, even hostility, by many of his fellow humans. But he didn't care. Rela was worth it. The woman who had once been thrust upon him as a slave had become his equal, his confidant, and the person with whom he wanted to build a future. Their union was a quiet rebellion, a rejection of the centuries-old hostilities that had kept their people divided. And as they navigated the early days of their marriage, they faced both the struggles and the joys of learning to build a life together, one that blended the best of both their cultures and defied the expectations of those who had sought to control their fates.